Blog Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope Elizabeth May. I am joined by Taylor Ackerman, Michael Buzzy, Randy Olson, and once again, special guest Dr. Jennie Jin, a forensic anthropologist of the DPAA, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. Welcome again, Dr. Jin.
Hi.
Hi. And also joining us is Lieutenant Colonel Tamara Fisher-Carter, who has so graciously helped to set up these dialogues. And today's show is actually a continuation of our show last week, which is part of a larger series that we're calling The Duty to Remember. We launched these series in connection with POW MIA Recognition Day, which was on September 18th of this year. It's celebrated every year, actually, through a presidential proclamation. But last week, we began our dialogue with Dr. Jin, as well as a family member of Private First Class John Shelemba of Hamtramck, Michigan. Dr. Jin, just to remind everyone, is the head of the Korean War Identification Project of the DPAA. We talked about what that was last week, as well as the sort of general mission of the DPAA. And what we were trying to do last week is really bring together these two recent identifications of Michiganders that have been made by Dr. Jin's team really in the last 2 years. The first was Private First Class John Shelemba, and then the second, who we didn't get to but we're going to talk about today, Sergeant First Class Johnnie Hill. And we wanted to bring these two stories together because although these two young men have some things in common. They both fought in the Korean War. They both went missing, and they've both recently been identified. The stories of that journey from going missing to identification of each of these men are very different, and I think it's very useful to just keep in mind the different paths that exist to final identification. So we'll be talking about that today, and I just wanted to sort of review what we did last time, and then I have a couple of follow-up questions from our discussion last time for Dr. Jin. We talked about Private First Class John Shelemba's identification, which began with his disinterment at the formerly called, I think, the Punch Bowl Cemetery, but now called the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. And as Dr. Jin explained, a number of remains came over in 1954, pursuant to the Armistice Agreement of the Korean War. I think, Dr. Jin, you said around 3,000 personnel were transferred to the United States after the armistice. It's around 3,000, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and amongst those 3,000, I think it was around like 870, I think, that you could not identify. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. And so they went into a sort of common area in this National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which is in Honolulu, and there they stayed. And Dr. Jin, last week you talked about how, like, individual family members would request these, like, individual disinterments or exhumations, and but it was in 2018 that you got approval to do these more mass disinterments, and Private First Class Shelemba was part of this first phase. You described these, who haven't done all of them yet. There's some, I think, 600 and something that still have to be identified, and you're just beginning phase 3. But I just wanted to ask you, like, how I think what you said was, you would get these individual requests from family members who had some information that a certain unknown was perhaps their relative. And I'm just wondering if you know or could speak about how they even got the information about that unknown at that specific grave spot, if that makes sense.
Yes. So each unknown has what's called an Xfile associated with it. So which documents, if the remains were found in South Korea, for example, then it documents the lost date and the recovery, like the estimated lost date, the recovery location, and circumstances. And sometimes the body, if the body was recovered with some kind of name associated to it, not necessarily a dog tag. It can be a laundry mark, which our service members carried with their laundry. And like all other things, like little ring or whatever that had some name, then those names are documented in each Xfile. So the Xfiles, the family can request it, and then they read it, and then they see their loved one's name there. So oftentimes that is not a correct association, because that's what back in the 50s, the mortuary was using that information to see if this unknown body belongs to that person. But oftentimes that's a negative. So that's how the family gets the name from. And sometimes, in very few cases, those names turned out to be correct. But simply there was not enough evidence back in the 50s to link the body to that name, and now we do. Okay.
And thank you for that. And if I recall, Private First Class John Shelemba's Xfile had some incorrect information. Is that correct?
Yes, it had. There was discrepancy in terms of his actual lost date. And what the Xfile said for that particular body. There was when the body was found, the estimated death date was a week after Shelemba's actual missing date. So that's why he did not make it back then in the 50s on the initial list of potential candidates. But our historians did the research and found out that the date for the unknown death date of July 20th was a generic date that the Army used for all the casualties around that time.
Yeah, so you talked about that piece of information last week, and in this particular case with Shelemba, it was critical, this historical research, to narrow down who this could be. And so I bring that up because, again, Shelemba's remains were in the United States since 1954, as we discussed last week, and then were disinterred pursuant to this approval to do this sort of mass disinterment project that you're currently working on. And I just want to mention that to contrast that with Sergeant First Class Johnnie Hill, who was not here in 1954. So that's coming up. But one thing I want to also just get clear on, because quite honestly, a lot of this stuff is totally unknown to me until I do research on it. And I mentioned last week when I went to the grave of my great-uncle in Margraten, Netherlands, which is a U.S. military cemetery there, actually. So I'm familiar with that cemetery in Arlington, but I really was not familiar with the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, nor was I familiar with what's called the Courts of the Missing, which you can find. It's like a part of the cemetery. And I was just wondering, Dr. Jin, if you could explain the function of the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific as well as the Courts of the Missing and how that connects to the missing of the Korean War.
So the Korean War unknowns, first of all, it's a beautiful cemetery. It's really, like when you drive up, it's on top of a punchbowl crater. So when you drive up and then it's to the right, That's where all the Korean War unknowns are buried. And it's really, I like going there for, just to go and reflect a lot of different things and connect with them to some extent. They're all buried as unknowns, but they all had identity, right? So it's my job and my team's job to figure out who that person was. So that's a nice cemetery. And when you go straight into the cemetery, there's a beautiful area up front with all the names of the missing service members. So I really like the story when the family members whose loved ones were identified through our project, and they go back and to that wall and then take a photograph of the names and say, now we found him. So, yeah, it's more than just the cemetery.
Yeah, and so I believe that this Courts of the Missing, it does have the names of the missing from the Korean War, and you have several, I think, Courts of the Missing, so that the cemetery is not just the Korean War; it's those lost in the Pacific Theater during World War II, and I think Vietnam now has a Courts of the Missing there as well. But I think I know that Shelemba's name is there, and I'm virtually certain that Johnnie Hill or Johnnie Hill's name is there as well, and so that's a sort of common place to find them, their names on this wall there. Does that sound accurate to you? Because it's the first time I'm sort of learning about this. Yeah, and when you do identify the remains as belonging to one of those names, is something done? Like, is there a marker put next to the name, or is there any kind of indication, status change that's done on the wall? Or
I would love to know that too. I don't know.
Yeah. So I was just wondering what happens. So great. And does anybody else on the call have any general questions or things that were lingering from last week, or maybe that came to you after you sort of sat with all the information from last week? I'll just start with Michael. Taylor, you weren't there, but Michael, anything?
I just wanted to comment, Dr. Jin. I thought your description of going to the punch bowl and sort of taking that time to sit within a place of quiet and calm and reflect and connect to individuals who you identified through your work, that was really powerful. I really appreciated you describing that. And I've never seen it before, so then it urged me to look at photos of it, and the cemetery looks absolutely beautiful. So I can only imagine what profound enlightenments and thoughts are able to come to a mind when you sit and reflect in a place that's so resonant and meaningful. I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Come join me someday.
Yes, we'll take a road trip, to be sure. And Randy, anything?
I have a general question for Dr. Jin. I'm wondering, I guess on average, how long does one of these identifications typically take, assuming all of the pieces sort of are there in a way that's, I don't know how to say normal or average, because it sounds like every case is kind of its own set of circumstances, but I'm just curious, what's normal look like as compared to what, this specific case is?
So that's actually a really great question, and I get that question a lot from all different people. But sometimes it can be very fast. I will give you an example when we get to Sergeant First Class Hill's case, not his case, but from that assemblage. It can be done in a month, but most of the cases, I would say on average, takes about 9 months or longer, because I always remind people that there is a reason that they are unknown to this day, especially the punch bowl individuals. because it's almost always a complete skeleton, and it would have been much easier to some extent ID them right after the war when the body was still relatively fresh. But for whatever reason, they couldn't be identified, and now we have them. So even processing DNA takes about 6 to 9 months on average with all the casework, because our DNA lab processes all other DNA too, not just from the Korean War, but from World War II, which is actually a much larger conflict than Korea. So that's the average time, and then we have to do dental analysis, and if something doesn't match, then we need to do further investigation. So sometimes it can take years, and sometimes we do have cases that we just can't figure out despite of everything that we did. So we do have some old cases, but just to give you an idea, our first exhumation for the Korean War unknown started in 1999. And from 1999 to 2016, so that's 4 years before now, right? So when you look at it, our identification rate is about close to 80%. So we identified almost all of them that we exhumed between 1999 and 2016. So generally speaking, we're trying to give about 48 months. That's our threshold before we revisit why they are still in the laboratory.
Cool. That helps me kind of gauge it. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Great. And so before we get into Johnnie Hill, I just would like you, Dr. Jin, to once again just give a little bit of history about the Korean War Identification Project, when it began, and also how it began, because it hasn't been around for so long. I mean, the courts of the missing preceded the Korean War Identification Project. So
I started in 2010, and a few months after I started, my boss, Dr. John Bird, he asked me if I can take all the elements, some of the elements from the Korean War. And it's not just because I'm Korean, that back then I was Korean national, not because I'm Korean, but I also have a background doing zooarchaeology. So some of you may think, what does that have to do with this? But zooarchaeology is the study of animal bones from archaeological sites. And as a zooarchaeologist, you always think that all the bones you find are commingled. They're all mixed. So it's not from one animal. So that's the framework that I'm used to using. So even if something looks like completely fine as one person, my mind doesn't work that way. So my mind is trained to look at that like potentially somebody mixed those up. So that way of thinking, I didn't realize how important that was until I actually started looking at these remains, especially back in 2010. The first assemblage assigned to me, we didn't have a name, like the Korean War Project didn't exist. So it was called the K208. So to deal with the 208 boxes the North Koreans gave back to us between 1990 and 1994. So those boxes were very, very commingled, meaning one individual's remains were scattered across like up to sometimes 15 boxes. So when I open a box, it looks like one person, but we quickly realized there are on average 4 people present in each box. So now my job was to figure out like where is the rest of that person in which box and how many do we have from this person. So for those 2 reasons, my Korean background and my zooarchaeology background, that's why John thought it was a good idea for me to do something a little bit more systematically. So we were still making identifications from the Korean War remains back in 2010, but he saw the need to make it more systematic in terms of the approach, right? So like, okay, let's say you open a box and there was an easy ID, for example. For whatever reason, it was easy. We make one ID. What about the rest of the bones? What about the challenging cases? So rather than piecemeal out, he thought it would be a good idea to have a dedicated project within the laboratory. So Korean War Identification Project is actually the very first project that launched in the laboratory. And then I wrote the SOP while I was on maternity leave with my first child. So the SOP is the same age with my daughter. So it's very near and dear to me, very personal too. So how to approach these commingled remains. So since then, we became pretty successful, and that's something oftentimes we don't talk about, but the improvement in the process can change the outcome drastically. So that's what we did, and we started to make a lot of IDs very fast after that change, the launch of the project, so which was then followed by all different projects, like the USS Oklahoma is a big project that we are successfully conducting right now. And also other projects like the POW camp that was in the Philippines that was operated by the Japanese. So we're bringing back the remains from the cemetery in Manila. So that's another project called Kabanatuan. So we have multiple projects launched since the Korean War Identification Project.
That's really interesting. And so you mentioned these like 208. Is that remains or is that boxes?
Boxes.
Okay, 208 boxes. And these were transferred from North Korea to the United States? Is that like over a period of years?
Yeah, over 5 years.
Okay. Yeah, and so that's really important because that transfer of remains is, how Sergeant First Class Johnnie Hill comes into the United States, although much, much later than 1990 to 1994. So before we get to him, anybody have any questions about the project, its origins, etc.? Going once, twice. Okay, so let's talk about Sergeant First Class Johnnie Hill. As we've said, he was also from Michigan, and he, as I just said, came over in a much different way than Private First Class John Shelemba, who came here in 1954. We didn't know it was him, but his remains came over in 1954, Private First Class Shelemba. Sergeant First Class comes over through a different route altogether. And I do have an audio clip that I'm going to play. It's about 2 minutes long, and I think it does a really nice job of summing it up. And then, Dr. Jin, you can sort of add to that, and we'll get into that discussion. This audio clip is actually from a video, which you can access on our show resources page. So it's on a larger story. The video appears on a larger story about this moment in history, which is 2018. And here comes the clip. It's about 2 minutes.
55 caskets, likely carrying the remains of American servicemen from the Korean War, were honored at a repatriation ceremony in South Korea Wednesday before being transported to U.S. soil, where forensic experts will begin the long and hard process of identifying them.
They can be positively identified and returned finally to their countrymen and their families.
The boxes were handed over by North Korea last Friday and flown aboard a U.S. military transport plane to South Korea, where U.S. officials cataloged the contents. Among them, a single military dog tag. U.S. officials say the soldier's family has been notified, though it was not clear if his remains were among those found. In fact, experts say positively identifying the remains could take anywhere from days to decades. The North Koreans provided enough specifics about where each suspected body was found to allow U.S. officials to match them to specific battles, but not to individuals. More than 7,700 U.S. troops remain unaccounted for from the Korean War. About 5,300 were lost in what is now North Korea. The remains are due to arrive in Hawaii Wednesday, where Vice President Mike Pence, the son of a Korean War combat veteran, will honor their return. The pledge to transfer war remains was seen as a goodwill gesture by North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un to President Donald Trump at their Singapore summit on June 12th. But there's growing skepticism about whether the North will follow through on its pledge to denuclearize.
Again, you can access that clip and the visual images that go with it. It's very useful at our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. And so Sergeant First Class Johnnie Hill's remains were within, I take it, these 55 boxes that came over in 2018. So Dr. Jin, do you want to add anything to that clip? Any details?
Yeah, sure. I was, to this day, just thinking about that day that we went to North Korea to pick up the remains, it really feels like a dream. It feels very surreal, especially because the town we flew into, Wonsan, that's when my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, was captured when she fled the communist regime right before the war. So she always talked about how bad the condition was and how nervous she was. Wasn't even sure if she could make it to the south, and that was that city. And I flew our C-17 military cargo plane into Wonsan in a very different circumstances. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away in 2012, so she couldn't see me going, but I could somehow connect to my grandmother. Going that way. So it was very personal. And then just like both sides of my grandparents, they all are from North Korea initially. They came down right before the war and during the war. So it just felt like too unrealistic, like I'm really going into North Korea. And then the reason I was going was to pick up the remains of the service members who could not make it out. Just like my grandparents, they all did. And I mentioned it last week, just like my father's parents who came down to the South on the U.S. Navy ship. So it was like all together, I was very emotional. You know, so it's a different thing, like analyzing the remains. Like I'm very sciencey when it comes to that portion of it, but the actual trip to North Korea was very personal to me.
Yeah, that sounds so intense and surreal. And you mentioned last week also, like just the meaning in this work that you do. And how, you know, when your grandfather would talk about the war, it just like the Korean War just it wasn't resonating with you. But then working on this project that made you, look at it more closely. And so, I mean, it's a really beautiful story. And again, I repeat what I said last week about this work helps to end fragmentation. It promotes healing on many fronts, not just for the families, but in terms of bringing things to consciousness, drawing connections, education. It's just such valuable work. And I'm so pleased that you were given you had to write the SOP of this project, and you've been at the head of this project. It's a really incredible story, and we're really honored to have you with us to share the story. I just open it up to anybody who wants to comment on what has just been said.
I have a quick question. Is there anything on deck for you to be going back in the near future Or is there a reason for you to be returning, Dr. Jin, or was that like a once in a lifetime kind of set of circumstances? I'm curious.
I hope we get another chance to go, but we don't have anything yet. So as we heard from the audio clips that you played, this was part of the 4 bullet points that appeared on the TrumpKim summit agreement, which I was actually watching the summit, and that itself felt very surreal. I still remember it was late at night in Hawaii, and like, oh my goodness, what am I watching? Like, this is, I didn't even know how to describe like my emotion that day. But then I remember President Trump all of a sudden held the agreement and then showed it to the reporters, and they took a picture of it. So I didn't really think much, that must be like denuclearization and big topics. And then I got like interested. Maybe I should take a look at it. Maybe it's already online. So I Googled it, and it was online. And the 4th bullet was the return of POW MIA remains. So I knew something like that could happen, but I did not expect it to be on the actual agreement. So I still remember that shock, like, oh, my life will be a little busy. And then a few days later, my boss, again, Dr. Bird, he called me at like 7 a.m. And then I was like, oh, John is calling me. And my husband says, he's asking you to go to Korea. So I picked up the phone, and sure, that's exactly what he asked me to do if I could that day.
Wow.
So that's how I flew to Korea. I spent about a month negotiating with the North Koreans about how to do this, and then potentially going into North Korea for excavation after the unilateral repatriation, which then kind of stalled. So this unilateral repatriation of 55 boxes did happen in 2018, but we tried to engage the North Koreans since then about the possibility of us going in for actual recovery operations, but we have not heard back from them.
That has been done before, correct? There actually was a time when, yeah. Can you just talk about that a little bit and when that was?
Yeah. So after we received 208 boxes between 1990 and 1994, there was a 1-year gap in 95, and then we started going in for our own recovery from 1996 to 2005. So it's quite long, almost 10 years of recovery operations covering 33 missions in the 2 major battlefields in North Korea. So we brought back quite a few remains from there. And when you look at the identification numbers from those, so the first one, the unilateral repatriation of 208 boxes in the 90s, we identified about 150 plus. And then from the remains that we brought back from North Korea, we identified about 150 plus too. So that's, and we're still working on those remains. Now there are more challenging ones are left. But yes, we have been to North Korea, and I hope we can go back.
Michael, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I had a question, Dr. Jin. Well, did you get a chance to, when you were in North Korea and through your negotiation process, did you get a chance to talk with the North Koreans about, the work that would happen with the remains once you were able to get them back? Did you discuss, that we were going to go through this process of identification and, reuniting these individuals in a way with their family? Was that ever something that was discussed, or was it more so just like the logistics of, okay, we're going to be going in, and then this is what we're going to be doing, and then we're leaving it at that? I'd really love for you to touch on that if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, the first portion was during the negotiation. The North Koreans were actually really well prepared for the meetings, and that's one of the first things they said. They emphasized that even if the 2 countries were enemies, we are returning these remains to their families because it's the right thing to do. That has been their opening statement. And then they will move on to the logistics of it. Like, okay, so let's establish that, why we're doing this. And then we're moving on to discussing the logistics.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So you were there then, and I've seen pictures of, these like wooden boxes, and at some point, I guess when they get to South Korea, or maybe when they're on the plane, but at some point they're draped in UN flags. So of course, when you get them in North Korea, they're just plain wooden boxes, and then there's, I guess, a ceremony. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yep. So when we arrived at the airport in North Korea, in Wonsan, which is actually Kim Jong-un's hometown, that's why they proposed, pick these up at Wonsan. So we went in, and then we spent 3 hours, exactly 3 hours. And what we've done in North Korea is they already had all the boxes laid out, 55 boxes. Those are the boxes we provided to them across the DMZ. Our truck drove the boxes, and then they put the remains there. And there were also civilians, the anthropologists present at the airport. And they were talking to me. They felt comfortable after an hour. Okay, she speaks Korean, I can tell her. So they were telling me they did their best to segregate these remains into an individual. However, there could be a mistake. So that's what they said. So, we knew because it's not a complete skeleton. Like Shelemba's case from last week, punchbowl remains are in a pretty beautiful condition from head to toe. But the remains we're talking about from North Korea have not been preserved that well. So it's like fragments of bones, fragments of long bones, a little bits and pieces. So we're talking about two very different kinds of assemblages. So that's what I was told in North Korea, and I said, I appreciate your comment. And then they mentioned the dog tag that was mentioned in the audio clip you played. And they said maybe his remains are in the same box. That's what they also said. And then after 3 hours, the boxes were loaded onto C-17. And then as soon as we reached a safe altitude, we all started draping the 55 boxes in the United Nations flag. So the reason we did not use the U.S. flag is because under the armistice agreement, we fought as the United Nations troop, not the U.S. troop. So that's why everything we draped very quickly. We had to do that very quick because it was only an hour flight. It's actually, if you fly directly, it's about 20-minute flight. But we could not pass the DMZ area, so we had to fly all the way out to Japan, and the area towards Japan, and then flew back in. So that gave us enough time to drape all the caskets, and we landed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, where we had a nice ceremony. All the military family members living on base, they came out to welcome the remains. And then, so that was really, really nice. I was very nervous. I don't know why. I'm back in South Korea, but still very nervous right before the C-17 opened its back to the public to view. And then, that's how we came back. And then when we arrived in Osan, we unloaded the boxes. And at that point, we already had everything set up in one of the large areas there to go over each box to make a quick preliminary analysis, just to make sure we are actually transferring the possible U.S. remains. So nothing like there was a talk about maybe animal bones are in there. So those are the things that we had to check prior to moving the remains, but there were no animal bones. There was nothing. It was actually, the North Koreans did a pretty good job. They packaged them in a very respectful manner. So that's what we documented in Osan in 2 days. And then the remains were loaded at Osan and flew to Hawaii. And during that flight, which is a much longer flight, about 9 hours, we changed the UN flag to the U.S. flag.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And that's how we had the ceremony in Hawaii.
Amazing. So all of that is a really, nice context. That's the sort of background of Sergeant First Class Johnnie Hill's journey from North Korea to Honolulu and eventually to your lab. And so can you talk about his identification? How was that done? Like you talked about with Shelemba last week, if you could give the details about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's different about these, so we called it K55. So the first one I referred to from the 90s, we call it K208. And this one we call K55 because there were 55 boxes. The issue with this was we expected this to be very similar in terms of preservation, the bone preservation, and commingling will be very similar to K208. And we turned out to be right on that. So when you open these boxes, they were very fragmentary. So unlike the punch bowl remains, where we can do a lot of different things, like analyze the biological profile, and look at the trauma. You can do a lot of different things with those skeletons. But with this one, with K55, you can't really do any of those because the bones were pretty degraded. So we had to rely heavily on DNA in this case. So we had to create an inventory for all the bones. 700 plus bones came in. So we had to do that and then decide which ones to sample. DNA sampling takes time, and it takes time and money. So if you know for sure that this left arm goes with this right arm, for example, then you don't have to sample both if you are sure that they go together. Unfortunately, we couldn't do a lot of those because of poor preservation. So we sampled almost everything for DNA and also for isotope testing. The reason for that is isotope testing cannot tell you who this person is, but it may be able to tell you if that person had more rice-based diet or corn-based diet like the United States. So our hypothesis was we will see a lot of South Korean soldiers present in here who fought with us too, just like the other assemblages. So we thought about it and we sampled them for both DNA and isotope in August 2018. And then we got most of the results back within a year. And so far, we identified about 70 individuals from K55, and one of which is Sergeant First Class Johnnie Hill. His case, so for 55 boxes, the North Koreans have been really good at one thing since the 90s. Whenever they gave us the box, they will always put the recovery location of the box, which has actually always been very accurate. A lot of people at first suspect, like, oh, are you sure they gave us the right information? But they did. And so for this one, 55 boxes, the North Koreans broke them down into two large regions from our two major battlefields, one of which was East Chosin. That's where Sergeant First Class Hill went missing in December of 1950. His remains were found in box 26, so each box was labeled with a number and only a single element ID. So unlike Shelemba's ID, remember how his niece talked about how surprised she was to see how many bones, how complete the skeleton was. K55 is a completely different situation. Most of the identifications were made with 1 to 3 bones that we received. But he wasn't one of the cases who were ID'd very quickly soon after the repatriation. And there is a reason for that. because we couldn't do age estimate or like anything, stature, we couldn't do anything, so we had to rely on DNA. And we always use what's called the mitochondrial DNA first. Mitochondrial DNA, whoever has the same mother will have the same mitochondrial DNA. The beauty of that is you can make a comparison. And the downside of it is that it's not individual specific, right? Because you and your sister will have the same mitochondrial DNA. So that doesn't, other people may have the same mitochondrial DNA. So we always do that first to come up with a shorter list of who this could be. In this case, Sergeant First Class Hill's mitochondrial DNA was actually very, very unique. It was the only mitochondrial DNA found in the entire Korean War database. But we still have about 800 service members from the Korean War that we do not have mitochondrial family reference sample. So we cannot completely rule out this will not match one of those 800 service members. So we needed another evidence. That's when we do additional DNA testing called nuclear DNA. That's a little bit more individual specific, and we could we could try to compare them to his brothers and sisters. And fortunately, we had his brothers and sisters. We had really good coverage when it comes to his family reference samples. So we tried nuclear DNA on the bone, but it failed. So that case, we were like, oh, what to do next? And then we were thinking, if we can prove that this is like really solid, these remains are actually from the guys missing from East Chosin. If we can establish that his mitochondrial DNA is so unique, we can actually make an identification. So we had to wait until the other cases go first to establish that this ID will be solid without nuclear DNA. So we had to wait a little bit. That's why his ID was not made soon after we received the remains, but eventually his ID was made that way.
Amazing. So it's really the uniqueness. And that also happened in the Shelemba's case, that it was his clavicle. Yeah, so that's really, really interesting. And DNA was not used in Shelemba; it was used here. And so the nuclear DNA, why did that fail?
Simply, so in each cell, this is like biology 101. In each cell, we have one nucleus, and so we will only have one copy of nuclear DNA. However, mitochondrial DNA lives outside of the nucleus of the cell, and we have up to 100 copies. So 70 years after the war, it's a simple matter of probability. Which one has a better survival rate? Most likely mitochondria, because you have more of them, like 100 times more than you have nuclear DNA. So that's why it's a lot more challenging to get it and get a sequence from nuclear DNA. So that's why it failed.
All right. Okay, anybody have any follow-up questions about the process by which Johnnie Hill was identified? I'll start with Taylor and just work my way around.
So I guess this is sort of a segue. Going back to the reference to the isotope testing. What is done to the do you transfer the bodies that are seem to be South Korean remains back to South Korea, or do you try to identify them in your lab? And then also, do you ever find individuals who might be with the UN but not with the United States forces? Or is your project only limited to working on U.S. forces?
That's a really good question. So for the foreign nationals in the Korean War project, if they turned out to be Asian, we share that information with our counterpart in South Korea. So this case, we did it too. So since 2012, we started repatriating the South Korean remains. And in the past 8 years, we repatriated 239 sets of South Korean remains back to South Korea. and each one was received by the South Korean president. It's a very, very nice ceremony. They will all come to Hawaii, and then we'll look at the remains. But leading up to that usually involves about a year of collaboration, like sharing the DNA results and then sending samples for MACRI to actually do the identification. We cannot do the identification because we do not have their family reference samples. So that's another privacy protection. So that's why our laboratory in DPAA, we cannot do it. Even if we could do DNA analysis in-house, we cannot compare that to anybody because of privacy reason. Those family reference samples are protected at AFDIL at Dover Air Force Base in our DNA laboratory. Same thing, the Korean family reference samples are stored in the laboratory at Ministry of National Defense in South Korea, and their coverage is pretty low. So of all the Korean War missing, the Koreans from the Korean War missing, they only have about 20-30% of the family reference samples, which can be very difficult to make IDs, and that's probably why they have not been as successful as we are. But despite the very low DNA coverage from the family members, they identified 13 individuals from the remains that we repatriated to them.
So for Dr. Jin, one of the most interesting things for me personally, about this continuing conversation has been that in both the case of Private First Class Hill and Private First Class Shelemba, it was their key to identification was like a really unique aspect of who they were as a person ended up being the thing that led them to being identified. So I was just wondering if in other cases of identifying the other soldiers, if it normally ends up being a really unique thing to that person that then ends up getting them identified instead of just, and I guess that would apply to, if you're using DNA, then obviously an individual's DNA is then tied to them, but I didn't know if in most cases it was something specific, like a clavicle or something like that.
Yes. So the cases, like, for example, very tall person, very short person, or very unique DNA. So those very unique clavicles, those are the cases that we can identify first. And those cases are not that difficult. But as we move towards the end of for example, K208 project, we believe we have about 50 individuals left, 50 U.S. individuals. So why are we not identifying them? It's been like 30 years. Why do I still have them? That's because there is something, they don't have something that's that unique. So for example, the easiest way to think of it is like if you have a name like, very common name, like John Smith, then you need to figure out which John Smith we're talking about, right? So that's in a situation like that, it gets very challenging, and that's when we have to be very creative in the laboratory to think of a way to narrow it down. And that's what we're doing right now actively, because we don't want to give up. We're done with relatively easier cases compared to these 50 individuals left, but we also want to identify these individuals. So we have less number of service members left in the lab from K208, but it may take longer to identify them.
Thanks. And Randy, do you have a question?
Yeah. So my question is regarding the big picture about the statistical likelihood of a false ID. So it sounds like at basically every step of the way, there's a serious care being taken to reduce the likelihood of a false ID to basically zero. But could you potentially walk us through, like, each step, like how close to zero the process actually takes in your lab?
Yeah, so that's always our concern, right? That's my that's what keeps me up at night sometimes. Like when I'm proposing an ID, is this a good ID? Like I need to make sure that I'm sending that person home, right? So it's because if I make a mistake, it's a disservice to not only the family that I'm sending the remains to, but the actual person who we are sending. So the other family may still be waiting. So a science method, which is never 100%, right? So if anyone tells you I have a method that can be correct 100% of the time, I don't believe it. But we try to reduce it, and each ID always has some kind of risk. But let's say if the biological profile of the remains is consistent, dentally consistent, and clavicles are a match, and DNA is a match, and the lost location also matches, then your chance for mis-ID becomes really low, right? So what are the odds for all of this to match to someone else? That's very unlikely. So in that case, the risk will be like 0.00000 something. But you can do the exercise, right? And then you can say, what if everything matches, but that person doesn't have dental records to compare? So, and then what if everything matches, but that person doesn't have DNA reference samples from the family to compare? And where do you draw that line? We are being very conservative, so it's not, we don't have a set answer. You cannot have a set answer because it's also the qualitative comparison you make with clavicles. So we can never come up with like, this is the standard, it has to meet this. But we are always trying really hard. And back in the days, there have been some mis-IDs, but very few. But in that case, what we do is that's because given the scientific knowledge we had at the time, that was our conclusion. And then, 20 years after you find out that part of that conclusion was wrong, then we reach out to the family. The family has been very cooperative and they completely understand where we're coming from. So we never cover things up. If there was a mistake, we'll come forward and then explain it and we fixed it.
Well, thank you. That helps me.
So back to Jesse Johnnie Hill. He was not the only Michigander to come over in the K55, as you've been calling it. Others were identified as from Michigan. I found, 3 others at least. Army Corporal Charles Lawler of Traverse City, Army Sergeant David Alexander Ferriend of Kingsley, and Army Sergeant Walter Tobin of the Glen Lake area. And is that to your memory that, I don't know if you keep track of state by state, but I think that Jesse Hill, is the most recent identification from Michigan. Does that sound right?
I believe so. We do have all the hometown locations of the missing service members and the ones that we identified, but I don't track it by state. But we, 2 of my first analysts on the team, they were all from Michigan. So I bet they are very excited about this podcast.
That's great. And I also just wanted to, Taylor asked the question about the isotopes and the identification of other ethnicities. And you mentioned before that the K208 and your experience with that sort of primed you and, sort of set the frame for the K55 batch, if you will. And so I think you implied it. Is it correct to say that in the K208 there were also some South Korean soldiers identified in that group?
Yes.
Okay.
So both K208 and also our own recovery operations, and from K55, we all had about 2/3 of the remains turned out to be U.S. and 1/3 to be South Korean. So it's a fairly large number. But yes, and that's when we use isotope analysis to see if we can differentiate what they ate. So in America, it's mostly corn diet, and you may think, oh, well, I don't eat corn, but we do eat a lot of products and also meat that had the animals that were fed corn or also corn syrup products. So we have very high corn signal, which is different from a rice signal. So that's when we look at the bones, and so we establish the baseline data. So this is a product of a long time collaboration between our laboratory and the South Korean counterpart. So they provided us some samples with the South Koreans to see, you have to make a baseline data, right? You have to show that they are different to be able to use it. So we started this project almost 7 years ago with the idea that maybe we can eventually use this in the laboratory. And now we have a separate team within the lab just dealing with isotope, and we got some machines. They're currently going through accreditation. So I'm excited to see that development, and maybe with isotope analysis, it may be able to help us to do like hometown origin, things like that. So because some oxygen isotope looks different based on the water that you drink. So the water from Michigan will be different from the water I'm drinking in Hawaii. So if you look at certain types of oxygen, that may help us with these more challenging cases, and also to differentiate the South Koreans from the U.S. service members. And also going back to the previous question I got about do we have any other service members from other United Nations countries? And the answer is we could. So that's why we've been collaborating with the Australians and the British. And also we do have some Dutch missing family reference samples. They all gave those data to us. So we have it. And whenever we get a new sequence from the bones in the Korean War project, we compare the sequence to everyone, including U.S. and all of our ally forces. And then maybe one day isotope may be able to help us if we can say like this person grew up in Australia, for example. Maybe that can help us, but nothing yet.
Amazing. And the remains that you identified as South Korean in the K-55, they were returned to South Korea in a sort of repatriation ceremony. Is that correct? Yeah. Did you have any? Were you there when that happened? Or did you witness that?
So in this year, in June 25th. So that's the anniversary of the Korean War. So the Koreans had the largest repatriation ceremony, which was part of their bigger 7 years Korean War anniversary ceremony. And they received 147 individuals. That includes all the remains from K208 and K55. So that was really very well done. The South Koreans did an amazing job on their end with this repatriation. And they invited the family members of 7 family members whose remains were identified from that group. So all the family members were present to receive the remains.
So were you there in South Korea when that happened?
No, I was there in spirit.
Very good. And it's so interesting because you've mentioned the MOCRE, and if you don't know what that stands for, that's the Ministry of National Defense Killed in Action, Recovery, and Identification. That's a mouthful, which is the South Korean counterpart. We call it the MOCRE. And relatively new. You mentioned last week that they have been, benchmarking the DPAA, but can you just talk a little bit about the history of the mockery?
Yeah, the Korean government started the recovery and identification effort as part of the 50th anniversary of the Korean War. So it was 20 years ago, but it was a small-scale mission, and it was a temporary mission. But then it became a little larger, and then eventually in 2007, MACRI became an independent agency rather than an attached unit to the South Korean Army, which it was 7 years prior to. So since 2007, MACRI evolved so much. We used to provide trainings. We'll go over to Korea for 3 weeks at a time, twice a year, and provide training. And that's also because we're allies, and also it's good for us too, because South Koreans find quite a few American remains during their recovery. And we identified some of the remains that they found for us. So it's in our best interest to make sure that they are very well trained. So we spend a lot of time training them to the point now they became really good. We don't really need to train them anymore. So we don't offer that kind of training. It became more of a scientific exchange rather than a one-way training to them. And the South Korean government recognized my boss, Dr. John Bird's effort to help them since 2007. He's the one who actually really helped them a lot from about all different things, like what kind of machine is good to do this. So they recognized his effort and gave him one of the highest medals that you can receive. Last week, the President Moon awarded him the medal. Unfortunately, he couldn't travel due to COVID, so the Honolulu consulate here threw a small-scale ceremony for him.
Which medal is that?
Tamil medal.
Okay.
You can look it up.
That's amazing. So that just happened. That's really, really interesting. And I just want to connect that with some things we said last week, just about the seeds from which the DPAA grew. I mean, more recently, JPAC and so forth, but we did talk about the Civil War and the advocacy of families, the agitation of families demanding the government to provide a full accounting, et cetera, and how that really ripened during the Vietnam War with the National League of Families, and that basically led to this broader effort. You talked about it last week, of the DPAA, not just being focused on the Vietnam War, but the missing from all of our conflicts. And I can't help, and please correct me if you think that this is an accurate judgment, but that there's a kind of, and I mentioned this last week, an education going on, and it's very difficult for me not to see that this advocacy of families is also impacting what South Korea is doing regarding their unaccounted for. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that, if you think that's wrong or yes or...
Yes, absolutely. This has it's very powerful because it's very personal, and even I'm the post-Korean War generation, grew up in Korea, and never really thought about the war because that was the sentiment in the 80s and 90s when I was a child. We're done with the war. It's embarrassing, so let's just move on and not think about it. So it's economic development was the main thing. I still remember all different propaganda focusing on that and leave history behind. But now I think it's the time to reflect and, just stop for a moment and think about it. And I saw a survey from Korea showing that the younger generation don't even know what year the Korean War started. And that was shocking to me. Even my generation, we all know that. Same thing here in the U.S. Like Korean War is like mostly people give me this blank, like, look, like when is that? Because it's, wedged between World War II and Vietnam War, which are also, not very fresh in a lot of younger generations' mind anymore, right? So, but with our mission, because it's so personal, anyone can relate to that. Like, what if your brother went missing one day? And so this is a very powerful dialogue that you can initiate. And to me, it's very important on all different levels. Like wherever you are, if you see it as a strictly humanitarian and it's like good for the family, closure, grievance, that's also one layer of it. If you want to talk about your country and the things that people do to sacrifice for your country, you can open that dialogue up too. So it's a very powerful subject.
Indeed. Yeah, this show is part of a series that we're calling Duty to Remember, and so we also see this as, there's this ethical dimension, and there's an obligation. So all soldiers take an oath to the U.S. Constitution, and then what is promised in return for that oath, and that is, you will not be forgotten. And so this is just part of that agreement, if you will, between the United States and the families and the individuals who serve and defend the values of the Constitution. So I want to say also about mockery, if you're interested, there is on our show resources page a video that talks about the South Korean counterpart of the DPAA. It's from Arirang TV, which is a English language television program in Korea. So I encourage you to look at that video to learn more about the South Korean counterpart. I did read that mockery does have a policy on enemy remains. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, South Korean government has to deal with so-called enemy remains, the Chinese and also North Korean remains, ever since the war, because the casualty was so high, many million of them died in the South Korean area too. So what do you do with them? North Koreans usually don't respond to the questions like what to do. And, China and South Korea have not normalized their relation until very later in the 90s. So what do you do with them? So Korean government created a so-called enemy cemetery near in Paju city, near the DMZ. That's based on the Geneva Convention. And buried them there because it's based, according to their law, you cannot bring a known enemy remains into Macri's laboratory. So the remains were there for a long time. And then in 2014, South Korean President then Park Geun-hye, when she went to China for a meeting with Xi Jinping, she proposed the first repatriation of the Chinese remains back to China. So that's been going on since 2014 annually. So I don't think there are any more Chinese remains left at Paju Cemetery. And the name of the cemetery has changed to North Korean Cemetery.
I see. That's fascinating. I'll just open it up for any questions, comments. Going once, twice, thrice. Okay. So then we're sort of closing out, and I presume that, given what you've said, that mockery has not worked with North Korea on any recovery missions. They have not, unlike the United States, which at one point did go into North Korea to do recovery missions. The mockery, I assume, has not done that. Is that correct?
that is correct. A couple years ago, there was a military agreement, the 919 military agreement, and one of the agreements was to conduct a joint excavation at the DMZ, which never happened. So the South Koreans are still conducting an excavation at the Arrowhead Hill along the DMZ, but the North Koreans on their side, so it was still not like an excavation supposed to be like together at one site. So it was supposed to be the North Koreans will conduct their excavation on their end of the DMZ, and South Koreans will do it on the south side. But they never showed up.
Well, it's an area perhaps to be worked on, and who knows what will happen with the U.S. election. But yeah, so maybe there will be an opening and a return to working together, we hope. So we will begin the process of sort of winding down this very, very interesting conversation. So Taylor has left us, I believe, so I will just turn it to Michael and see if you have any final thoughts, questions, comments.
Yeah, Dr. Jin, I think I'm going to end with a question to you. You know, there's been all of this amazing work that you have undergone, spearheading this truly incredible project that has really struck and resonated with all of us who have worked on this Duty to Remember podcast series, and just that it transcends national boundaries, and it's in a way also very individualistic and profound. And like you had said, you know, most Americans it's just blank stares and no recognition or cognition of, you know, what the Korean War is. But if you're able to relate your work in an individualistic level of I'm returning this person to their family, that strikes a chord with people, and I think that's really profound. So I guess my question is, where do you see your field of work going once the Korean identification process is complete, and once you move past like the USS Oklahoma? Is there a long list of other sites to be identified? Are there places in different countries? Are there wars to go back to? Where do you see yourself, I guess, in that process?
So the Korean War project will last at least for another 10 plus years, because we still have about 400 sets of unknown remains from the punch bowl to exhume and to analyze. So to be realistic, it'll take us a long time. And I see myself as if I can see that part being done, I would be really happy. But we still have our casualty from World War II is still very large. So we'll always have remains to recover and identify.
Thanks.
Thank
Randy?
you so much.
I'd like to end with a brief comment. It's something that Hope mentioned very briefly earlier with regard to the constitutional commitment to soldiers, and basically promising that if they have ended up making the ultimate sacrifice, that the U.S. government is to do, at least the least the U.S. government can do in payment to that is to at least bring the bodies home. And I'd like to, as has been my habitual behavior, to state the obvious, that you're one of the basically front line with regard to that particular promise that the United States government makes. And I'd like to express the deepest gratitude that I can summon to you for holding the United States government accountable to the people who have made the ultimate sacrifice for the well-being of the rest of us. And so you and your team do something that, as far as I'm concerned, is of supreme utility, because I see no value higher than truth. I see no nothing more important than promise keeping, and you are the group of people responsible for holding that ultimate accountability to the people who perhaps need it most, or deserve it most, at least. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can't help but something I've said repeatedly throughout this series is it is the families that sort of made the importance of the promise apparent, and made the government, quote, conscious of the importance of that duty. And so they too are very important in, as I've said, moving us forward. It's a process of evolution and moral development of the state. And I've mentioned her before many times, and some of you know I'm about to mention Bertha von Suttner again. And if you, again, are hearing this for the first time, who is she? She's the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905, and she inspired Nobel to create the Peace Prize. And one of her quotes goes as follows, quote, "Politics can only develop into a state worthy of our progressing civilization if the essentially female qualities of gentleness and dignity would penetrate political life." And I just see a connection between that quote and the work of the families, again, primarily women, chiefly women, really, because it was men who were doing the fighting. It's a little bit different now, but in terms of ripening our commitment to remember, and it's not just the government's commitment, it's our commitment as well as citizens, to know this story. I think that's absolutely part of building a community of memory, which we're trying to do. And Lieutenant Fisher-Carter, would you like to add anything as we close out this dialogue?
I could not have said it better as far as the thanks and the gratitude. And also, I haven't been with DPA that long, and so Dr. Jin, thank you also for educating me on the details of that. That was really, really great to hear. And also to the students and teachers listening through the stress of the holidays, take some time for yourself to reflect. And if you've listened in today, to just internalize everything that you're going through and what they've gone through. And I wish you the best through the virtual, the virtual schooling. And best of luck to everyone. That's it.
Thank you so much. So we will end it there. And again, just great gratitude to you, Dr. Jin, and to you, Lieutenant Colonel Fisher-Carter, and your teams that you work with. The DPAA works with other organizations in the Department of Defense. And so it's a group effort, it's a team effort, and we are very grateful to have you at the helm. Do check out our show resources page, virtuesofpeace.com. Again, there's a show from last week that, we talk about Private First Class Shelemba and have his niece on the call, and that's very powerful to witness you, Dr. Jin, connect with Michele in that show. So, Dr. Jin, I'll give you the last word, and then we'll say goodbye for now.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share the work we do. And as I mentioned last week, we'll always do our best to make identification as fast as we can without cutting corners. Mm-hmm. And thank you to everyone who served and who is serving.
Hear, hear. All right. Goodbye, everyone. You've been listening to Virtues of Peace. Stay safe and stay sane. Bye-bye.